At the start of the Afghanistan war, Jeff Stern arrived in Kabul with the hopes of making it as a journalist. He often reported from the heart of the violence, getting scoops on stories other reporters missed. It was thanks in large part to his driver, translator, and friend, Aimal. Jeff's now out with his third book, The Mercenary. It tells the story of their strong bond, one that survived the chaos, misunderstandings, and life-threatening dangers of war.
Jeff is an award-winning journalist who's also the author of The Last Thousand, about the Marifat school in Kabul slums that educated both boys and girls. Jeff is also a recipient of the Overseas Press Club Award for Human Rights Reporting and the Amnesty International Award for Foreign Reporting. Jeff was in Washington, D.C. to promote his latest book, The Mercenary, at the Politics and Prose bookstore. I sat down with him before the event to discuss the driving force behind writing the book, his friend, Aimal.
What were you thinking?
I wasn't, I think.
How would you describe him? Because I think he's just such a character in so many different ways. And talk to us about this chance encounter, how you got to meet him, and it really kind of developed not just as a guy driving you around town, as a real friendship.
Yeah. When I first met him, I think I saw someone to help. And I think that when he first met me, he saw someone to help. He was really charming. He was just this sort of skinny, scrappy kid who always knew a shortcut. He was really confident in his English, which was really bad. And that in itself was just funny. You know, if I try to speak another language, it's very halting because I know so few words. And he just sort of kept going. And that was endearing. And he was also, it was clear immediately that he had this protective instinct. And I would only realize years later exactly how he would kind of marshal that. And there were some really clever ways that I was totally unaware of that he protected me, that he looked after me. But I was aware of the fact that he wanted people who were his friends or associates or that he had any connection to, that he wanted them safe, he wanted them comfortable. He had that kind of hospitality instinct. And at the same time, and I don't think I quite realized this right away, but he just had a sense of hustle. And he could get past any checkpoint. He was always pretty smooth. And of course, it was years later that I would realize how far he took that sense of hustle and that kind of smoothness and that gift of gab. But from very early on, it just felt like when we were hanging out together, you know, we were gonna have fun and anything was possible. And there was no security checkpoint, there was no closed road, there was no city that wasn't there for us to explore.
As a journalist, you had zero support system. I mean, really, when you think about it, it's him. And he wasn't just a driver. And, you know, when you work in a newsroom, you have an assignment editor who's calling and making phone calls and getting pieces of information, sending you out on a story and stuff. He was your assignment editor. I mean, he knew when stuff was going to happen. He would tip you off. I mean, how valuable was he in that regard?
Incredible. He was everything. He was the entire bureau. You know, he was security, he was the driver, he was the translator, he was logistics. And often you're right, he would find the story. And because I had no access to anyone, the beat became just normal people gathered around the site of a bombing or a shooting or whatever the story was. And that was entirely him. I mean, that was him just going from this person to this person, saying, you know, yeah, Jeff, he says this happened. This person says this happened. And him just like pulling different people together in order to help me weave a story. In a lot of ways, he should have been a co-writer on those stories, but all the information came through him. And he had these ways of knowing what was going to happen. It almost felt like before they happened. And that's another thing that, you know, years later, as I tell the story from his perspective, begin to understand how he was able to do that. But at the time, I decided not to question it. He just had this almost preternatural ability to say, there's going to be a Taliban attack in this part of the city at this time.
When violence erupted, Jeff and Aimal raced to the scene to report on the casualties and the extent of the damage. Aimal made sure Jeff stayed safe, but the author never realized until much later the toll the violence took on his friend.
he was your protector too. I mean, he could tell when things were getting hot, I got to extract you. You were always had the notepad and wanted to get one more quote. And at one point, he takes you to the morgue. He like advances the story for you.
Yeah.
And I think that section of the book is really telling, because you approach what that morgue experience was for you, and yet the morgue experience for him was entirely different. And you see it through the eyes of a journalist from the West who's telling a story, but you also see it as a citizen of Afghanistan who's seeing his country torn apart.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really telling as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's another moment where I had this, in the moment, I had a pretty simplistic view of what was happening. We were seeing this very horrible thing, and my mindset was, here I am with Aimal, he's really tough, plus he's inured to this. You know, he sees this kind of stuff all the time. So I'm the one that really needs to protect myself here emotionally, mentally, you know, as I'm experiencing this trauma. Even though these were human beings, this horrible thing had happened, I was able to, in some part of my brain, section it off and say, this is not my home. This is not me. This is not my life. This is my job. Which is uncomfortable to admit, but I think that's how a lot of us are able to sort of see something and then go on with life. He, in that moment, I thought was totally fine, because again, he's used to this kind of thing. And it didn't occur to me until, again, like way later, that it actually doesn't always work that way. That sometimes if you see something that some kind of, you're exposed to some kind of trauma that rhymes with something you've seen before, it can exacerbate it. It can invoke all the things that you've experienced so far. And he, of course, had a really traumatic upbringing through the early Taliban years and the Civil War. He saw a lot. And when we were at that morgue, that opened up everything else for him. And he still, to this day, has nightmares about that moment that he facilitated, but at my behest. That was a way that I basically traumatized him.
You saw a lot of bad things, you say, and one of the other features of the book, and maybe you can talk about this because I thought it was really interesting, is, you know, as I mentioned, you kind of tell your story and your love of riding growing up and that sort of thing, but you tell this story about being in Montana and being on a bus and being bullied. And remarkably, as you tell his upbringing, you tell a story about him seeing a girl go on the bus, and I think he winks at her, boom, she's shot and killed.
Right.
So you both have these traumatic experiences on a bus, but I think it's very telling of, okay, here's somebody living in the West, their traumatic bus story, and his traumatic bus story.
Yeah. I'm glad you picked that up, because also that was trying to do something maybe a little bit too clever of saying, like, look, even we were sort of fated to meet, you know, this sort of me as a second grader or whatever, him as a second grader, and having these sort of similar but very different experiences. And my hope is that by spending some time with, you know, young Aimal, with someone who's trying to get by and trying to succeed as a kid in a country where there's a lot of violence, and then the violence stops because the Taliban is there, but then there's drought and famine. And it's not a sob story. He's clever and able to manipulate his surroundings even then. But that it, in some ways, it kind of licenses or at least explains the decisions we make later in life, and some of the things we feel we have to prove, you know, and how having just very similar, but in some very key ways, different backgrounds, different origin stories, the sort of butterfly effect of how that can end up sending two lives in totally different directions, and in some cases, back intersecting again.
In the chaotic withdrawal of U.S. forces, more than 78,000 Afghan allies were left behind. This is according to a report by the Association of Wartime Allies. These were Afghans who applied for a special immigration visa to the U.S. The most common job of these applicants was interpreter or translator for the U.S. government.
You wrote this: writers who go to war zones tend not to be supportive of war, although we might be accused of having a kind of chemical dependence on it, a hatred and a need for it. Can you talk about that need? Because we hear about this a lot, you know, where war correspondents are just adrenaline junkies, and I've even talked to a general who was at the tip of the spear in the invasion of Iraq, and I asked him, what was that like? And he said, oh, you're never more alive than when you're so close to death. You know. And I'm sure you've heard expressions like that as well, but what is it? What's the intoxicant there?
I think one of the things, I can speak for myself. I mean, being someplace, in some ways it's easy. In some ways, covering conflict that's expressed as conflict is easier. You know, it's easier to write about someone shooting a gun than it is to write about interpersonal conflict or things that aren't, that aren't on the surface. I think it's also easier to find real light and almost, poetry and beauty when it's in such a stark and in some cases violent contrast. And maybe this is an example. If I tried to pitch this book about a friend of mine from Petworth, it wouldn't be that, it wouldn't be that compelling. It's sort of because we're from these different worlds and also because there's violence around it. So I think as a writer, as a journalist, there's an adrenaline for sure, but there's also almost an ease, almost an accessibility to the story if you can physically get there. The literal accessibility is often another story. But finding things that you feel motivated, that you feel motivated to express, and things that feel worth sharing, I think are in some ways easier to find and easier to outline and easier to identify. The more hostile the area is, the less hospitable the area is. And I think also the more external the conflict is, the more external the violence, in some ways, the easier. And we get into this a little bit in the book, but when Afghanistan collapsed and a lot of the desperation and the pain and the suffering was just with us all the time on our phones, it wasn't a place we could go and then come back from. That to me was much harder and in some ways more dangerous than visiting a dangerous place and then leaving.
It also created a lot of introspection on your part, and I think there's real pain that pours out on these pages. Did I use these people? And now they're stuck there, and I'm over here. That was you. You could go back to Philadelphia. They were always going to stay there. Yeah. Talk to me about that inner struggle dealing with that.
Yeah, I remember from very early on when I first went there, and I couldn't afford to go back and forth. I got a low-level job to sort of support my writing habit, and I would always be jealous of the people who parachuted in and out. I was there for 6 months at a time, a year at a time. So the adrenaline, the excitement would kind of wear off, and then I'd just be left with the discomfort of being in a country that wasn't mine, which we all, many people experience. But for me, being in a new place where there's a novelty, there's an excitement, there's a little bit of danger, can kind of cover up for, wait, I don't really speak the language. I don't really know how to get a sandwich for myself. So I was conscious early on of the fact that there were people who stayed and people who could leave. I wasn't really conscious of the fact that I was one of the people who could leave. And I don't think that really hit home until 2021, until the collapse of Afghanistan, when I wasn't there, and the sort of pain and desperation and struggle was just all around for anyone who'd spent time there, or anyone who was from there feels that. So and I think that's another part of the humility, remembering that you're going someplace far and eventually you're going to come back. It could be in a month, it could be in a year, it could be after a 20-year intervention, but you're going to come back, and not everyone is going to be able to. And I think that's a really important thing to hold on to as early as possible, because it quickly becomes too late.
Since the Taliban took control of the Afghan government, the United States took in more than 76,000 Afghans. Jeff is a founding board member of the 30 Birds Foundation, which has helped hundreds of Afghans, including school-age girls, evacuate their country.
Jeff, talk to me about the 30 Birds Foundation. What is it, and how did you become involved in it?
So when Afghanistan began to collapse, probably a few months before August 2021, which was, of course, when Kabul totally collapsed, there were just a few people that were personally important to me, that we sort of casually tried to find university postings or think tank jobs, some way to get them safely to the West, to Europe or to America. And as those months kind of wore on and we got into August 2021 and things became more and more acute and we still hadn't gotten people out, it became sort of an emergency operation. And there was one family in particular that I was very close to the father, and he started a coeducational school and was at risk. And a few people who'd come together from different parts of the world, different ways of having connections to this one school, came together to help this guy get out, help him get across Kabul and into the airport compound as the city fell. And there was probably 5 minutes where the two people in England, the one person in San Francisco, me, and kind of said, "Wow, look, this is amazing! What just happened?" And then someone raised the point that we've just deprived this school of a leader. And within another 10 minutes, we're trying to figure out how to get basically schoolgirls across the country, out of the country, into the West. And what followed was basically a year and a half now of trying to get people, especially, particularly at-risk people, which was largely schoolgirls from this very progressive coeducational school, out of the country and ultimately to Canada, where there's now a growing community of this this sort of satellite campus of this school in Saskatoon, of all places.
You can look at this as a story about a bond between two men, but you can also look at it as this is how the world is through the Western prism, and this is how the real world is too. And I think if you take a step back and read your book, it's a lesson to all of us about and you even talk about this, listening. Like, I go over there and I listen, but I don't really listen.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a problem, not just with reporting, it's foreign policy, it's kind of how we see the world. Can you talk about kind of the larger viewpoint of all of this?
Yeah, I try not to editorialize. This is not an essay. Obviously, I'm trying to tell a story primarily. But if there is one thrust, one argument, it's that I do think we could do with a little more humility. It's hard, and I say this in afterward. I think it's hard for journalists, for war correspondents, not to have this uncomfortable kind of unholy alliance with war. We kind of need it, and yet most of us are opposed to it. I think if you experience it, it's hard not to be opposed to it. And I'm trying not to say, here's an anti-war book, but rather if we're going to do this, if there are justified wars, if there are justified interventions, then surely at least we can be a little bit more humble, a little bit more aware of what we don't know, in a way that I was not, and hopefully it's sort of a caricature of, here are some small mistakes, and in some cases in the book, some big mistakes that can happen when you go barreling into a place thinking you know things without really taking the time to actually learn, to actually listen.
Let me finish with one question. As I read this book, there's parts where you just laugh. I mean, one that comes to mind is when he's living in Canada and suddenly his boss keeps bringing all these clothes and they somehow manage to fit him. And, I'm just getting rid of it. It's very, very funny exchange. But then there are lots of spots where you cry. And I want to ask about writing it, the process of writing it. I mean, you must have shed a number of tears as you were banging away at the computer. Was it a catharsis? I mean, talk to me about.
In some ways, maybe it was a catharsis, although for me, the way I work on these things, and maybe need to change this, is I get so obsessional over trying to sort of control the reader's experience that it becomes not it's rarely me sitting down, sort of taking a sip of my coffee and then just flowing. It's often, what word can I put here that'll where the reader is less likely to get distracted? So in some ways that might be my own kind of repression at work, right? That might be me preventing myself from really feeling what's on the page. But I kind of yearn to work on something where it is just, sitting down and letting the angel come and then writing. But this was not quite that.
Was it a struggle or?
Yeah, it was a struggle. They're all struggles in their own way, but this one in particular, because it's so personal, and so I think there's an expectation that it's that it's sort of natural, that it's me. And sometimes people reading and say, I feel like you're talking to me. And I sometimes think that's such a huge compliment and I mean, anyone who reads a book these days is that they're giving me a gift, I feel. But there's no part of that book that's not, that for better or worse, and I think often for worse, that I haven't redone and re-edited and moved things around 70 different times. So I often wonder if that is me, if it is me as if we were just talking at a bar.
Well, you say it's a gift. They're reading the book, but it's clearly a gift to us. I mean, it's a great book. Thank you so much for visiting.
Thank you for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Fantastic.
Thank you.